Hello and welcome. This is the first time that Bastrop County Historical Society has done a virtual quarterly meeting. So for those of you that are watching from home, I'm so glad that you can enjoy this presentation tonight. My name is Jennifer Ellisor, and I'm representing the Historical Society as well as a 28-year member of Bastrop Christian Church. I also want to mention that our church will have a display at the museum January of 2021. We have a lot of artifacts and things, and so I hope you will come to the museum in January and see what else we have. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker tonight is one of our elders here at Bastrop Christian Church, Earl Ellisor. Earl and his wife, Kathleen, are relative newcomers to Bastrop, arriving in 2005. They grew up in Galena Park, Texas, and lived in Clear Lake, a suburb of Houston, for 37 years, where they raised their two sons. Earl retired from IBM in 2010, then taught and volunteered at Bastrop High School for a few years. Kathleen and Earl were CASA volunteers for 5 years, and Earl was on their board for 2 years. Earl is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin in math and physics with honors. The couple now split their time between Bastrop and South Fork, Colorado. Kathleen volunteers with the sing-along group at the nursing homes, and Earl enjoys genealogy and reading, and they both enjoy gardening in Colorado. They have 8 grandchildren.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think we're now going to see if we can make this technology work. I'll turn off that. I'm going to leave that on. Now, how's that? I guess if you're online with Zoom and you can see the slides, raise your hand, please. Okay, got everyone. If you're here, I'm sorry? Share my screen, thank you. My hearing's not as good as my voice. Let's just go back to here, do a share screen. Does that help? Got it? Okay, now we have to go back and do this again. Start the slideshow from the beginning. And this is just, if I had a director, we wouldn't have all these problems. We'd be able, the director in the booth would do this. How's that? All right. So once again, I'm Earl Ellisor, and we're going to have a lot of information tonight. I tend to talk fast, but that's good because it keeps you awake. We're going to make a lot of mistakes. I'm going to be corrected a couple times. I got Bob Long here. That scared me when he walked in. I got LaWanda Simon here. That scared me even worse. So I'm going to be corrected a lot, but I get to make the first correction. And that is, there was some literature that came out when we announced this meeting, and it said, Earl Ellisor, Bastrop Christian Church historian. Now, that's wrong on 2 counts. First off, we do not have a historian assignment or title or anywhere in our church. Secondly, I didn't do any work on history here. What I did for the last few weeks was I just assimilated into this presentation kind of the highlights of some information that other people had gathered before me for the centennial 25 years ago, and then a scrapbook here called Bastrop Christian Church 1850 to 1970, and there's another one 1970 to the present. I went through those and I just extracted this and that, made up a few stuff to make it kind of fill in the gaps, and lo and behold, this is where we are. And so let's just look. This evening what I plan to do is talk about the history up until the church was built 125 years ago. That's why we're here. 125 years ago, this building was busily under construction. When we see in a moment some pictures of what the details are and how quickly they built it, I can tell you they were sawing and hammering and scaffolding must have been going. They must have had 25 men working here to finish this church in 6 months, which is 7 months maybe what it took them. I'm going to talk about the building some. I'm not an architect. I'm not a historical architecture. I'm just going to tell y'all what I have read with a few pictures, and then I'll leave you to explore on your own. Talk a little about the history the last 70 years since it was built, 75. And then I think the most important piece, and I hope we get to it, if I talk fast we will, and that's the people of Bastrop Christian Church. This is the history. I'm going to just go over this briefly. And you can't talk about the history of a Christian church, and I mean that in terms of the denomination, the Christians, the disciples of Christ, which is what this church is, unless you talk about the origins of that particular denomination, Protestant denomination. And I'm not a theologian, I'm not a historian, but I learned a lot in researching this a little bit. I invite you to use your history interest to go back and do this. But in the early part of the 19th century, there was a movement called the Restoration Movement. And it was purely American. That's one of the unique things about it. It wasn't Methodist, it wasn't from Germany, it wasn't Anglican, it wasn't from Britain. This was American, and it grew up partly as a necessity of theology, because the two gentlemen, and one of them's son, Thomas Campbell and Martin Stone, they weren't in agreement with the way worship was going in the Presbyterian church and the Baptist church and the Methodist church, where they had some of their roots. And they wanted to simplify things, both in terms of church organization and church autonomy, as well as the focus of where their church teaching should be and the time they spent in church. So it's a much simpler church than the other churches that have a lot of rules and liturgy and things coming down from above. They're independent churches. The disciples of Christ and the Church of Christ, and when you see an independent Christian church, those three denominations fell out of that Restoration movement. We can trace the actual formation of disciples to 1832. They used the name before that, but it was just Mr. Campbell. When he joined forces and decided to have an agreement with Mr. Stone, they officially formed the church in 1832. That's how far back it goes. And it was on the frontier. It was in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and that area, which was pretty much unsettled as far as cities go. I mean, there were homesteads. But as the cities moved west, the church moved west with them. And it tended to establish a church in county seats. So in most places, you have a Disciples of Christ church in the county seat. That makes sense. If we move over here to about 1850s, there's a reference in the Austin American Statesman, or probably it was either the American or the Statesman, because there were two papers at that time, of a Campbellite. That's what people would call these Disciples of Christ, because they were followers of the Campbell and his son. They would call them Campbellites. There's a Campbellite parson doing baptisms in Bastrop County. So there's a reference, and we have to think that that was the beginning of this church. We don't know for sure, but we think so. We also know in the 1850 census, there is Mr. Rutherford that they're talking about with his wife, both of them born somewhere else. I think it was Tennessee. And they have a 3-year-old child, 2 children, the oldest is 3. We can surmise that since that child is referenced as born in Texas, that they had been living there for 2 or 3 years. And maybe the child was born in Nacogdoches on the way here, I don't know. But we can surmise that they were a family, and it gave his occupation as parson, which is unusual because they probably couldn't pay a parson here. He was a farmer or a skilled person or of some kind, and he did preaching and baptisms on the side, but he considered himself a parson, or the person taking the census, who may have been a neighbor. He considered him a parson. They just wrote parson in there. But that's a clue for us, 1850. And so we go along, and throughout the 1850s, we see several references to marriages and activities in Bastrop County, mostly in the advertiser, things going on with the name Christian Church. When there's a marriage license and the minister signs it, he says Christian Church. It's a clue that there probably was a Christian church here in the 1850s. But in 1857, there's a distinct reference that they're holding services in the courthouse. The Christian church is meeting in the courthouse. So we know that for sure. So we can kind of put our stake there, but I believe it goes back even earlier. And then, like I said, for many years, during the 50s and until 1866, which another major thing happens, there were marriage records and other records. The Millennial Harbinger was a newsletter put out by the Disciples of Christ back in, I don't know where, Memphis, Philadelphia, wherever they were headquarters. I think it was back east somewhere. But it would have news of the church's growth, and it listed Bastrop as a church, and it kind of, I don't know if it listed how many people joined there, but at least there's 2 references in the 1850s to this church. There's also a reference in the advertiser that the Christian church and the Masons were planning to get together and build a building on Main Street, a brick building. They didn't do that, but at least it was a reference that they had met, so we know the church was organized. And what we do also know that they were meeting in something called the Red Building. I don't think we know what that is, but I did see a references to a particular cotton gin or feed store that was the Red Building. And I think we could probably find out where that was, but I'm not sure. Bob, if you all know back from, Ken didn't know either exactly where it might have been. But that's a good research thing for somebody to say, where was the church? Because it was meeting in that feed store until it finally decided to get its own building in 1867. And one of the church members, who later on I saw a reference 30 years later, he must have been pretty important, Hugh McDonald. At first I thought when we look at the deed at the courthouse, which I only have a copy of, it says he sold it to the church for $1. That's a typical thing for people to do in real estate transactions, to hide how much they really sold it for. I'll sell it to you for $1, but you give me $200. But the public only thinks it was $1. But I'm thinking, based on what I saw later in the advertiser, that it really was a donation, that this man bought the land, donated the lumber, is another reference I saw, and there either was a stone church on the land, which is what most people think, or they built it. And the reason I think they may have built it is because they talked about Hugh McDonald donating the lumber to build the church in one of the articles. It's, once again, we don't know for sure, but we know that they acquired the land. We know it was a small piece of land, and it was on this spot, and it was the church for the next 30 years or so. And it was a stone church, or rock church. We hear a lot of people talk about the rock church, and that was it. This is not it in the picture. That's just a rock church that I found, so I would know what to talk about right here at this point. So then we come to 1895, and a gentleman named B.B. Sanders comes along. And Reverend Sanders, I thought for a long time, was the minister of this church at the time it was built. But the clues that I'm seeing, and I talked to Ken about this some too, he probably was a member of the disciples out of Austin. Because you see his name in other churches, like in Elgin and McDade. You know, he preached there on a Sunday. And I think he may have been pretty important. He may have come here and worked quite a bit to help get the church started, the building, I mean, to get the building fund and all that had to transpire for that to become a building. And then he was only here until 1896. So he was here at 95 and 96, just while the building went up. But we certainly owe a lot to him because he probably was pretty much of an organizer. We also know from one little blurb in the advertiser that they bought a lot. They extended the size of this lot. It was so small that the church and a little bit of land, I guess, around it wouldn't fit. They had to buy a little more lot than the rock church. It was on Diagonal Street. So Church Street was called Diagonal Street. I don't know when the name changed, but it was probably sometime in the early 20th century. And they had lots of fundraisers. There's references in the advertiser to oyster dinner, to a play at the Opera House, and they even have the name of the play and the cast of characters. I'd love to see the Opera House find that play and put it on, but it probably isn't as funny now as it was then. And they had a speaker come in, probably a motivational or a minister type speaker that was very popular, and they charged to come and hear him speak. They sold fruitcakes. The way I understand it, I think this is church. Well, I did see one sentence about fruitcakes being sold, but that they were sold to buy these pews. And I meant to put a chart in here, and I forgot the actual recipe handwritten that we have. Who knows what year it was written. It may have been written years later, because as I understand it, selling that fruitcake recipe was a normal, recurring thing in this church. And in fact, the ladies of the church have cooked us some fruitcakes tonight. And I haven't tried one yet, but I saw photographs, and I can tell you my wife told me to bring her one. She wants one. So they're probably pretty good. Anybody tested them yet? Okay, all right. Oh, no, look at Roger. Roger put both hands up. Okay, so I think he's tested them. So there was a lot of fundraising going on, and they built the church. As I said, they built the church, I know, from July to February. Maybe it was a little later in July, maybe it was late in January, but here's why I know those two dates. In the advertiser, there's a little legal notification. If you want to make a bid on building the church for the Christian church, submit it to Erhard's store by June 15th. Well, I doubt they started the church before July 1st, but they must have started it pretty quick, because there's also a notice in there that the first meeting in the church is going to be on February 23rd, 1896. So that's just 7 months, maybe 8, depends, yeah, almost 8. So that was pretty darn fast for this building when you look at it, especially when you look at some of the accoutrements on the outside, and it's how tall it is. They didn't have power tools. There was no lift like they used to put this roof on. There were no power saws. They were sawing everything by hand. They were nailing everything by hand. I suspect there were, like I said, elves everywhere working on this church. The architect is recorded as Mr. John White out of Austin. I could not find any references to him, and I'm a little surprised at that. I did find in that period a John White architecture firm in San Francisco, and it was a national firm. This may be, I'm happy with some research, this may be architected by somebody far away. They sent the plans and they built it. This church could have been built 10 times around the country for all I know, exactly like this church. To me, that would be a typical thing to do as opposed to buying an architecture's time to build your church, especially if you're going to build it in 8 months. Okay? And the builder, we only know him by his last name. He's mentioned in the advertiser. I love the sentence that says, the church is going to be a jewel for Bastrop, and it's coming along nicely. Mr. Slomaker is using only the best materials and the best workmanship. I really made me proud to see that there, that the advertiser at least, and probably the city, thought this was going to be a jewel added to Bastrop. The cost, $3,400. In today's dollars, that's about between $85,000 and $90,000. Still a bargain. Still a bargain. You couldn't buy this lot for $85,000. But of course, I shouldn't say that's only the building. The lot was here, but you couldn't build half of this church for $85,000. You couldn't build the stained glass windows for tens of thousands of dollars. And here we get into architecture, Queen Anne style. That's all I know. You have to go look that up and read about it if you're interested in what Queen Anne style is. This is what the church looks like on a Sunday morning. A little different than you see it now because of COVID, a little different because of the electronics we have here. But that's a good photograph. We're very fortunate on a Sunday morning. We have light coming in through the windows. I've been here at night for some services, and it's just not the same. Daytime service in here is just marvelous. And the windows, that's what makes it marvelous. There's 24 stained glass windows. To me, they have that 19th century look. Ken and I talked about them some. He had a word that I can't remember and he couldn't spell because it was French, that essentially said windows that do not have images in them. They're just geometrical. This is how they come from the factory, and then a church might choose to put a Bible scene here and somebody pays for it, or put a memorial there for veterans of World War II. You see that a lot in churches. I like the way we've done this. It looks like it was built the day it was built. It looks like you're here at 1895, and you can get the sense of worship and the sense of awe that they had at the time. One window in particular, Ken really wanted me to talk about this, and I will say, when I've been a docent here, when I've looked at the material that people have prepared for us when we've had visitors, we say, look, we have a Star of David window. It's in the back there. You're allowed to turn around and look at it. Usually only the people up front, like the minister gets in the choir, they get to see it the whole service. That must be a tribute to Jesus' Hebrew heritage. That must be a tribute to us being a very ecumenical church. It's the Star of David. I'm sorry to tell everyone that's not true. Okay? That is a star. It's a star like the Star of David, but you find that same star, the two opposite triangles, in other Christian churches as far back as not Westminster, but Winchester Cathedral in 1380. And I've referenced this in my accompanying narrative that I wrote, actually where I found that. It is not a common thing in Christian churches, but it's not an uncommon thing. It wasn't until the 19th century that the Jewish faith started adopting that officially as their symbol. Around 1895, it became official. They had used it like the Christian churches had. They had used it earlier. It's so easy. Children can make that. It's a star, and it takes two triangles. There's lots of symbolism you can talk about with it. The one I saw that I liked the best was the triangle pointed down is God looking down at us, and the triangle looking up is us worshiping and giving back to God, and they meet together, and they're equals. Okay? We're meeting God through Jesus on equal terms because he was a man. So, that's a good explanation. There are others. I saw somebody call it the Star of Creation as opposed to the Star of David. But I think we need to stop talking about it being the Star of David and that we're some kind of special church because we have a Jewish symbol in our church. I talk real fast, and if you raise your hand, I'll slow down. I'll answer your question. And same thing with the people online, Kay. So the building. There's a nice paragraph in this brochure that we use when we're docents during when we've been on the tour of homes at Christmas time. And it has a lot of terms that I don't necessarily understand. I picked out some photographs of the church, different elements, just to show ourselves. And then you can go around later, and when I have this paper written online, you'll be able to see it. But the sun rays, which you see above the entrance there that you came in, that's a theme that's repeated several times in the church. I'm looking back here. Yeah. I'm sorry, where? Yeah, right here on the side. Thank you. Yeah, see those sun rays? That's repeated throughout. And that's, the creation, the light of the world. There's lots of things we can say that's emblematic of. The hammered truss beams, I didn't notice those till I started walking in the church. Those are delicate, and they have survived 125 years. That's that curved board right there that appears to be holding up that eave. It's decorative, but it still gives that appearance. I'm sure maybe in the Queen Anne homes of the Queen Anne period, they really did hold up something. And then this grapevine, and that little circles there are grapes. That's also repeated around the church, okay? And there's several Bible verses, and we know of one in particular of Jesus telling his parable of the grapevine. So that's great. And then over at the right here, we have the bracketed capped lintels. The lintel right above the window, and they're layered. And then that little metal thing at the top, that appears, there's several of those around the church outside. They're the originals. We have not replaced those. It's amazing to me, and it's a tribute to the people that have been in this church for 125 years that they've kept it as well as they have. Vicki sent me this photograph a few weeks ago, and I don't know which door it is, but I just thought it was remarkable. Doug's pointing to it on the two outside exterior doors. That is the door hinge, the original one. Look how decorative it is. I would have never noticed that if somebody opened the door and looked. And see, I've gone out that door dozens, if not hundreds of times, and I never noticed it. I just thought that was really remarkable. Just a little aside. If you come to the display we're going to put together for the museum, we'll have other little artifacts. We don't have a lot, but we'll have a few. Speaking of which, one of the sad things when you reach 125 years old and you look back and you try to reconstruct, it's sad, and especially 170 years since the church began. I wish we had a church historian because we have some information, but there's so much missing. And I really forgive ourselves and our ancestors because they were focused on the mission of the church, which was not history. But it's just sad, as those of us who are students of history. The weather vane on the top is original, and it says Christian, and I will say that if you didn't notice earlier, my first little chart about the history, 3 of the little artworks there. Did anybody recognize those? Raise your hand. You want to go back and show? This is a test. This is a test. Was anybody paying attention? You see the four right here, the 1850s, 1857, 1858, and the top. Anybody recognize that? Please. There you go. Doug does, but I don't count him because he cheats. All right. Darlene does. Darlene, where do you recognize it from? Where? No, where do you see these? Those photographs are all from the mural at the First National Bank. Okay? Our church is in our mural at least twice because that Christian sign is there, and then there's I didn't have it here, but there's our church just drawn just like it is. And I think it's there 3 times because if you look at the one here, 1858, look at that church there. To me, that's our church with the steeple reversed. So I think, although I could be wrong, maybe there was a Methodist church here that looked like that in the 1800s, but I think our church is in that mural 3 times. Could be that Reed Sharp had something to do with that. I don't know. But I also think it goes back to our church being, look at our church being kind of a jewel of Bastrop. People pass through here and they stop. When I was around more often in the office, a day hardly went by where I wouldn't find a couple or a young man with a tripod out here taking photographs of our church. And I'd offer them to come in. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. We've had people send us beautiful photographs that they took of it. So it is an eye catcher. It draws people once they're in Bastrop, and I think it draws people to Bastrop because we're also a very popular wedding location. People that don't belong to our church, don't belong to Bastrop, but they'll come here to get married. So I'm just proud of that, because of what the church has done. So now, you didn't pass the test, except, Doug, did you pass it? Yeah, he thinks he did. You didn't know where I was going? All right. So there's you can kind of see the elements I was talking about in, all together in this church. You can see the lintels up here above the windows on the steeple. You can see the curved archway that's holding that up. Those are all repeated around the church. And of course, we have a historical designation. I did not realize how important that was to some of our church members until we started doing the roof, and they wanted to make sure we didn't do anything to lose it. But it's right here on the door. We're proud. I'm sure a lot of work went into getting that in 1965, and so we've had it for 55 years. Incidentally, that's about the time the second roof went on. About 1969 was the prior roof to the metal one. Bob may remember this, 1954, I'm not sure. This is how the sanctuary looked in the 50s. That curtain, which I can just barely remember, I think it came down about the time I got here, of course, was here. And I'm not sure what the architect and the church had in mind to close off that space, unless they used it for a Sunday school class or something like that. But we use it as a choir loft now, and it works wonderful. But that's what the church looked like, and that curtain was very heavy material, very formal looking, like you'd see it in an opera house, and it was maroon. And I was so happy to see that leave. So Bob's trying to get to me there. So somebody said they put it there because we're near Highway 21 and the Aggies would just naturally, flow over this way. So another thing that I'm proud of, but I've never given an ounce of sweat to it, so I can just lean back and say how wonderful it is when I know there's church members that have given lots of sweat to it, is our memory garden. It was originated in 1992. One of the leaders of it was Gladys Dubois, Effie and Claude, and others. I will say Barb Poppy, Vicki Benson. Help me out here. Doug Perry, who's a professional at this. They put a lot of work into it now, but I know Barb worked on it from the time I came. She may be not doing it now, but she was a big part of this front garden. So it's something, once again, I see people stop here that are walking down the sidewalk, and especially using this bench right here in the front. But I've seen people walk back there. Someone told a story recently, either it was in one of these books that I used, or maybe, correct me, maybe I just saw it, that they were walking, it was somebody, a member of our church, maybe a deacon or an elder, They were walking from this building to that building. They looked at, it was early in the morning. They looked out here, and there was a lady on her knees, and they just backed away and went away. The point of that is people feel some serenity. It's in the middle of a little busy city. Yeah, we got Fisherman's Park, but that's very much a public park type of thing. This is a garden. You can come there and sit quietly. If it's not 95 degrees, it's got lots of shade, so even if it is a little warm, you can really enjoy it. On this right here, and Bob may remember this, there was a tree, and I don't think it was it an oak? Black walnut, that's why that wood looks that way. There was a black walnut here right beside the church. It actually had been planted too close because as it got old and was this big around, it was really banging on the church and it was dying. And we had to cut it down. And when we did, we left about 8 feet of stump. And then a gentleman came along with a chainsaw and carved out that cross for us. So it's kind of almost like a centerpiece for the garden, which is wonderful. And in one picture here, here, out towards that cross the back, you can see these cypress trees, small. That was a few years ago, and now you can see them here that they're taller in the back there. And I love these yew trees. We used to have something else there I didn't like as much, but I really like those now. Is that what those are, yews? Right behind the bench. Are those yew trees? Yeah, I love those. So now you know all I do about plants. So let's go forward now from the time of the church being built until later in the 20th century. And for the first 40, 50 years, the church was doing great. We had lots of membership, lots of fun. And I know this because as you go through the history book here that was written and they extracted things from the advertiser, you see events, you see birthdays, you see socials, you see, different things going on with the Bastrop Church. And in our own records, we have not many surviving records, of a few, Sunday school lists, a list of people who were donors, so you get an idea of who were the families and how active they were and how long is the list. And it's nice for a church this size. Then in the 50s, things declined. Membership started declining. And then by 1970, 71, I forget what year it was, I think it was 71, the disciples stopped meeting here. The church, I won't say dissolved because there was a spark that Cecil Long and others kept alive, but the church building was used by other churches of Bastrop. They were used by the Baptist Christian Church, by the Lutheran Church, but mostly by Calvary Baptist. And it was because they were building churches or they were remodeling their church, and this gave them a church home for a few years. But even during that time, we've got a couple of minutes of meetings where a small group of people, and it was the Sharps, and it was the Longs, and it was Hilda Sapp, and the Holtz, and maybe DeLong, I'm not sure. And they were still meeting. And they even met near the end when they were started to move back into the church to get ready to reorganize. They were meeting with representatives from the disciples, probably out of Austin. He would come and help them get organized. And they had some money, either money they donated or money that they kept from the previous years. And so in 1978, they did three things that are really very, very good. One is they moved back into the church. Calvary Baptist moved out. Secondly, they bought the house next door, which we always called the Little House. We'll talk more about it. And the land that was with it, Calvary Baptist Church had bought that, I guess thinking they were going to be here a while, and we bought it from them. So just in a couple of years' time, it went from the Knight family to the Baptist to the Christian Church. That's fine. That's great. And the third thing they did was they rechartered the church. It turns out when they chartered it, we actually have the charter, a copy of it from the court records. In 1898 or 1895, I think it was 98, we didn't know this, but the charters were only good for 50 years. And so here we are in 1978. I'm sure when Cecil Long and the others started getting ready to do all the legal things they needed to do, they realized we didn't have a charter. So they had to go through that process. But now in Texas, when you charter a church, it's forever. It's no longer just 50 years, which helps us. So here's a photograph. I put 1978 because that's when the church was reestablished or reinstituted. And that photograph, though, is from 1987, just to show that now, between 78, 87, 95, which is another picture I'll show you, the church has continued to thrive and be healthy. And that's a tribute to a lot of people. As I mentioned, we acquired the land next door, which was the little house and the adjacent land. That was very important. At one time, for 2 or 3 years, the church owned the brick building across the street and used it as a Sunday school and a restroom and things like that because they moved the little house away. That was the only restroom. Until they got that little house here in 1978, there was no restroom. I'm sure there may have been an outhouse. I don't know. Bob? Yeah, but before the little house, what did you use? We went to the hospital. Oh, so we did have the hospital. Okay. Yeah, went to the hospital. Okay. So that's good. I'm glad you went somewhere. I wasn't sure. So they had the little house, and then they had to move the little house away while they built the Ed building, and they bought the brick building across the street and used it for a while, and then we sold it, have the nice education building. And they also, in order to have a parsonage for the minister who had been staying in the little house, they bought a house on Farm Street. I didn't take a picture of it. Drove by it yesterday. It's whoever's got it now has really fixed it up nice. Then after we sold that, we bought a house on KDB for the minister. But now we have dissolved ourselves with that. And like I say in the board meetings, we're not in the real estate business. So I'm kind of glad that we only have the church to worry about. So the little house. I was hoping Ken would be here. Ken may be online. I hope he can see this because I would like to talk about it. This is the little house. A couple of observations. Look how close it is to the church. The church property was so small. I mean, it butts up right against the city property here at the library, and it only goes a few feet, if any, just enough to have a picket fence and to walk on that side. So it really was a plus to the church to buy that little house and the couple of acres, I think probably that it was. Don't know, can y'all see that fine? Yeah. Okay. The thing's interesting, but that's interesting to me. The other thing that's interesting is it's not such a little house. It's small at the front, but it's got that extension on the back. And then look at the very distance. See the smokestack? I believe that's the old ice plant. It was here when I first moved here, probably got torn down in 2006 or so. And so it was there. But look right at the bottom of the stack. To me, that looks like the library, which is there now. But I didn't think the library was there in 1995 or so.
We lost your video. Sorry. Somehow, don't have your screen anymore.
How's that?
Very good. Thank you. For some reason, it just stopped.
What have y'all got up here? Nothing?
There we go.
Okay. Little house, okay. So the smokestack right at the bottom of it, see those vertical windows? To me, that looks like the library, but I don't think the library was there. So that's a mystery to me as to what that is. Phase one of the library might have been there? Okay. Okay. The other interesting thing, so that's a mystery. I don't try to solve it here, but I just, yeah. 86. Okay, well, notice the road is still gravel. It wasn't paved. The stack was, but the library, oh, okay. Yeah. So the road was still gravel whenever this picture was taken. No, there was no curbs. And that big tree in the middle is still here with us. It's right outside the Ed building, so we can get a sense for the education building was built back, that far, and that's because we have parking. We have a small entrance and a yard along there. So it's just an interesting photograph. Okay, I've seen it a dozen times in the books, but I didn't really study it until I started this presentation. And the house, incidentally, was sold and moved, and it's somewhere in Bastrop in one of our large homes that we have as a master suite. So as you're driving around, as we do, show our friends that visit us the nice homes in downtown Bastrop, be on the lookout for it. I only put this slide in because Jennifer said I had to. Otherwise, it wouldn't be here. On the left, we've got the congregational photo of 1898, just shortly after the church was built. And on the right, we've got the photo from 1995. And Tim Crow was, I think I see him there. He had been the minister for about a year at that time. And the thing that's interesting, that's poignant, is there's 3 little children in the front of the old picture. Don't those ladies all look comfortable? Wouldn't you like to have been a lady on church Sundays then? I bet it took them 3 hours to get dressed just to get the hat right and the hairpins. I mean, I don't know how they did it. And then on the right, we got a lot of jewelry, I noticed on the right. There's also 3 children, 2 of which are lasers. And that's why she wanted me to show you the picture. So let's talk about people. I think we got to start with the first time the church was chartered, although I've got some other people in here in a minute. But the trustees, the people that had to sign the papers and do that was A.A. Erhard, his son A.C. Erhard, and Tom Kane. So I know A.A. Erhard and Tom Kane were probably pretty elderly because Tom Kane died in 1911 and his son Tom took over. And A.A. Erhard, as we'll see in a moment, was also a trustee or one of the first elders in 1867 when we bought the property here. So that guy had been around for a while. But these other people were charter members at that time in 1898. That's not the whole church, because we saw a photograph, or we have that photograph right there on the left. But these, I guess, were the ones that were listed as other people on the charter that was submitted to the state. I won't go through and list all the names. I was hoping, and maybe some people online, if they can see that, if there's anybody that says, oh, that's my aunt, or oh, that's our cousin, or oh, I moved here and they live next door to me. Because some of these are old Bastrop families. And now I got a busy chart, but that's mainly so I can talk. Yes?
The Fowlers, my grandmother was a Fowler.
Oh, yes.
But he's a great-great-uncle.
And you think this is them?
Oh, I know it.
You know it's them. So did you come to this church because of that?
No.
Because I know you used to live in Austin. That's great. That's a coincidence, yes. Anybody else? So there's so many good names to look at. My hobby is genealogy. This would be a genealogist's dream. I mean, I would love to sit down with some families and go back and just help them get started by using some of this information, some of the census information, and some of the land deeds and things. I put together a list of ministers. I don't think we had a complete one before. It's up to about 30 to 35 or 40, somewhere along in there. But I'm cautious because, as Paul Poppy told me once, ministers come and go. Well, I got a lot upset because somebody was leaving. He says, no, 3, 4, 5 years, and they're gone. And it's okay. So the list doesn't mean much. Plus, there's some names on that list that are there because we paid them. But they may have been itinerant. They may have just been coming because the pulpit was needed to be filled. And there were some that listed their title as elder. So they were preaching and getting paid, but they weren't really maybe an ordained ministers. But the list is there. It has some years beside each one. It's kind of like a puzzle trying to piece it together. But here's 3 names that I think really should be honored. B.B. Sanders, he built the church, okay? He didn't hammer a nail, but I'm sure his leadership, his organization, his support from the Austin or the state organization all led to this church. Bob Long. Bob Long was there to reconstitute the church as the first minister in 1978. Bob, how long did you serve? 2 or 3 years. Okay, so and it isn't just Bob. You know, it's that whole group of people that decided to rebuild it back up. That it was worth doing for this church. And I'll whisper this: get those Baptists out of here. So, and then Tim Crow, he was the minister when I came. And he was near the end of his tenure at that time. He was here for 15 years. Is that right? Yeah, 15 or 16, maybe 15 and a half. And that, when you look at the list of ministers, and I've got these dates, that's the longest by far. Most of them follow the rule that Paul Poppy gave me, 2, 3, 4 years. You know, there's one that was here for most of the 1920s or something like, or 1910s, but I'm not sure where he ended and began. So, the Erhards, there's a Bastrop name for you. They were here at least in 1867, probably before. And but the first record we have of them in the church records is 1867. There are records for them throughout the time. They're here in 1895, as we saw, when the church was rechartered. And there are Erhards listed up until the 1970s, when the church was eventually dissolved for a while. But there's one particular, I don't know the lady, but I just thought it was interesting. Mary Erhard Trigg. She was born in 1857. She was probably born into this church. Yeah, they may have come here a few years after that, but I think she was born into this church, and she died in 1940, also in this church. That's amazing. 83 years in this church. T.W. Kane, I already mentioned him. He established the Advertiser. His son took over. I'm sorry, T.W. was his son. Captain Tom was the one that was called captain. The interesting thing about him, besides being a member of the church, and you see Kane's a lot, you know, the children in Sunday school and him in the church, is he married the daughter of B.B. Sanders, the guy who led the building of the church. Now that guy left. He was no longer the minister after 1896. They got married 10 years later in 1906. So I don't know what happened there. Did he meet her when he was here in the 90s, or did he come back, or was he preaching in Austin? Who knows what the story is? It'd be a wonderful story to try to find out. But we know they got married here in this church in 1906. The Chalmers family, they're with us today. They were with us then. The most prominent one in the list of all the Chalmers was Calhoun Chalmers. He was the county treasurer before and after 1910. I know he was in 1910. I'll tell you in just a minute why. Cecil Long, I saw one reference to him as Mr. Bastrop. Cecil Long contributed a lot to Bastrop City, county, and even to the state during the years of a lot of growth in the 60s and the 70s. He was president of the bank. He has many other offices that he held. But his leadership in recovering the church is probably the greatest thing that we recognize him for. And on his passing, the board now has a light in the belfry, which they call the Cecil Long light. It's the eternal light. We try to keep it lit all the time. Some of the other families that I just see recurring over and over, you see them, you see their children, you see them being deacons or elders, are the Holt family, the Holmes, the Wirtz, Sapps, Triggs, Davises, and others. I just saw a reference in the history that was written at the time we opened the Ed building. Effie Sharp and some others put together a short history, and they mentioned Dolly Gregg. Don't know the lady. How many? I see some nods. That she went to church here, and they said what a wonderful lady she was. She was associated with the Opera House. She evidently dressed very flamboyantly. Did I say that right? She dressed up a lot. Yeah, she wore vintage clothes. Bodacious babes, okay. I was before my time. Sounds interesting, though. Juanita and DeLong Anderson, I didn't see them listed as when the church was reformatted in 78, but I saw that they were here as the earliest. So they must have been one of the leading families. And then about 1988 to the mid-90s, we got some people that are still with us. I do not know Marjorie Lee, but Nell McDonald I do, Jennifer Lazier, LaWanda Simon, and her dearly beloved husband, Cy, and Celia Fales, and of course her husband Jason. But I put the women down there because they're so active in the church. They get so much done, and they deserve at least some accommodations for longevity, if nothing else. Thank you, ladies. I can't talk about people of Bastrop Christian Church without talking about Effie Davis Sharp and her husband Claude. When Kathleen and I first came to this church in the spring of 2005, we were guests. We were just visitors. We just wandered in. The first person to talk to us, I don't know if it was during the meet and greet or it was after church or something, and she used to sit right here and we were back there, but she knew we were visitors, was Effie. She came, she introduced herself, and she did it so everybody in the church heard her. And she told me right away that she and Claude had been married in this church in 1947. That was something she was very proud of, and she made sure we knew it right away. But she was born into this church. She was born in 1920, and she died in this church in 2010. And as I said, she and Claude were married in this church, and they were very stalwart members, big contributors in every way, whether it was the garden, whether it was the Easter egg hunt, whether it was Sunday school, whatever it was, they were involved. Interesting thing I found out, her mother's maiden name was Reed. Everybody understand the importance of that? So here's her family. This is George and Duval Reed Davis. Her mother's last name was Reed. And I should have been doing this all along so y'all could see better. There's Kenneth Lewis, and that's Effie. I think about 1923, because she looks about 3 years old. And then here she is with Claude when they got married in 1947. And then here they are. I don't have a date on that picture, but I think it's about 1995. It may have been associated with yesteryear, or maybe it's associated with the 100th birthday of this church. Did y'all have a celebration where they might have dressed up in 1895 costumes? No? Okay. So it's probably yesteryear. Probably yesteryear. Okay. So when you talk about people, you got to mention them. Here's a photograph that Bob will recognize. It's on the wall over there in case he doesn't. That's his father Cecil and his mother Ida Lou. She went by both names, right? Ida Lou. On the front, that is the minister Grimes. And so that's all a very interesting picture. I think I also use it as, I don't know if everybody came to church that Sunday or what, but it's not a very big congregation. Okay, and that's probably the sign. This is 1959. The church wasn't as vibrant as it was in the 1940s and the 1930s. But let's look back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows in the bow tie. Anybody recognize that? Sitting next to the tall guy. Okay, that's Bob. And right next to him is Terry. What's his first name? Gene Terry. We'll talk about him in just a moment, right? Yes, his mother was, right? Yeah. His aunt was Hilda. And I go back 2 more rows with the hat and her eyes looking down. I think that's Hilda. At least the diagram I was given showed that as being Hilda. Does it look like her?
I can't tell that.
Yeah.
There's one unique thing is we had a large class of teenagers at the time.
Yes.
And we all went off to college, and right after that's when the church kind of functioned.
Interesting.
But next to me was Gene, and behind him was Linda Frida and Carolyn Layton, and Mr. Grimes' daughter Gloria was right back there.
I'll be darned. Those are all teenagers, yes.
And then the Layton family, she had 2 sisters.
Okay. We've got a little chart that names all these people, including the little girl in the back. And I've forgotten whose daughter she is, but she's one of
Probably
the ministers. Right, could be. Notice every one of the windows on the side here. They're out because it wasn't air conditioned as late as 1959. Must have been pretty warm in some days in here, but they got them open and they had these fans going, I guess. And I meant to show you, and I forgot, the picture from 1895. These windows are open, but they open from the top. They were leaning out like this, whereas these windows leaned out from the bottom. So we talked about, there's Bob, and right next to him, as he told me, was Gene Terry. And Terry was from the Sapp family. And in the upper left-hand corner here, we've got Laurel Sapp and her grandson, Michael Swinson. And that would be her grandson by Rosalie Sapp Swinson. And then we have Kenneth Sapp, and I assume that's her son. Yes, and then these were the girls. Roberta, Leah, Hilda, Natalie, and Rosalie. Hilda was one of the people who stayed in the church and was one of the officers at the time that Cecil Long reconstituted the church back up. There's a meeting where they list who all's meeting with the disciples' leadership to get the church started. Hilda's listed there. Once again, the women of the church are some of the strongest members we have. But I want to talk about Roberta. Roberta Sapp, once again, that would be the mother of the tall young man beside Bob, right there in the middle of the picture. That young man there. I hate to say this, Bob, but he's better looking than you. Okay? That was Gene. I agree, he said. So Roberta Sapp, this is another lady, besides the others I've mentioned, who was born, raised, and passed away, spent her whole life in this church. She's born in 1914, and her parents were Robert and Laurel Sapp, Billingsley. She died at the age of 43, so that was a tragedy, and that's why the story's here. She went to Bastrop schools. She went to Mary Hardin Baylor. She graduated from the University of Texas, interestingly with a fine arts degree, but when she came back to Bastrop, she taught math. She may have taught Bob. Did she? No, okay. She taught Sunday school, yes. In fact, in the notes from the Centennial Fund, they talk about the Sunday school class really loved her. And I think when she passed away in 1957, it must have been a big loss. She married Leslie Terry. I looked up where Rochelle, Texas is. It's up past Lampasas to the west. And he was killed in Italy in World War II. And Jean was probably less than 3 years old, I'm thinking. Italy, the battle in Italy took place in 1943. If he were married in 1940, he couldn't have been older than 3, maybe 1 or 2. Okay. All right. So maybe okay. He wasn't killed in Italy at the beginning of the Italian campaign, but at the end of it in the 44. Yeah. Okay. She was teaching math for 12 years at Bastrop High School. By all accounts, everybody loved her as a math teacher, certainly as a Sunday school teacher. She was a member of the Bastrop Christian Church Women's Fellowship, the American Legion Auxiliary. She was president of the Bastrop Teachers Association. And on her passing, the Christian Women's Fellowship of Bastrop Christian Church started a fund. And it was, I don't know how they did it. Maybe every week they gave certain donations, or maybe they had cookie sales or something, but it wasn't a lot. You can see in the notes as it grows a little bit. And it took until 1968 before they had $3,000 and some dollars, about the cost of this church. And they used that $3,000 and some dollars to build a chapel in the new hospital. And there's photographs of it right there, of the chapel. And it's today the Grady Tuck building. Jennifer, when we kind of put these pieces together, she went over there and looked and found the room and took a picture. It's just a file cabinet room now, which is sad, but you know, the hospital's been repurposed. So I just think people like this are worth bringing to our attention. Another one is Harriet Erhard. She was a Smith. The information there, the genealogical information, is from the back of this colored photograph, and it's written in the kind of handwriting that my grandmother had. You know the kind I'm talking about? It wasn't flowered, it's just almost not legible. So it may have been her that wrote it, it may have been one of her children, but it's interesting from a genealogist's point of view to have that information. Right down to her great-grandfather was born in New York City. So I found her to be an interesting person. And then this other photograph, you can see the church in there. See the windows on the side of the church? See the little picket fence? That's probably the edge of the property. I was looking at that, and in the picture, all it says on it, Harry Erhard and Friends. So my first thought was, well, her name's Harriet. Maybe she named her daughter Harriet, and they called her Harry. And my wife's looking over my shoulder. She just laughed. She says, Earl, that's 3 boys dressed up like girls. And she's right. It fooled me, but she's right. When you look at it, that's what it is. I have no idea what the occasion was or when the photograph was taken. We just know that one of those boys is Harry Erhard. And it may have been 1910. It may have been 1905. I just don't know. Another mystery for you historians.
He had the oldest grocery store in Texas.
Yeah, I've seen the sign.
What the rich family bought.
Yes, and we have a story in our books about them. They're not a member of the church, but they told a story about buying that, and then people in the church, especially Reed Sharp, helping them when they were without a place to live because of a fire at their business or something. It's quite a touching story. Yeah. I just couldn't present everything tonight. And in fact, I'm just delighted that Kay's let me go on and on. She may have already cut me off and I don't know it. Getting near the end here, Kay. I mentioned earlier the Chalmers, 1910, Calhoun Chalmer. He was the county treasurer at the time, according to the Advertiser article. It's about this big. And it talks about a ice cream social that was given in honor of the church. I think maybe they were still paying off money. I don't know if they had a debt or what, but they were taking money for the church. They were having a birthday party for the church. Would have been 15 years since it was built. And they were charging people 1 penny for every year they were old. So if you're going to lie about your age, this was the time to do it. But they bragged that even people who didn't come to the social still paid the money. And I just thought that was interesting. It was at what today is the Cochran House, but at that time it was called the Murchison House. They were actually renting it. Does anybody know where the Cochran House is? No, it's one of the old homes here. Yeah, you do? Okay.
It's on Church Street.
On Church Street, right down here, yeah.
It belonged to the LCRA before they sold it.
Oh, I know which that is. Sure. They just got sold in the last, recently, right? Yes. That's quite an estate, yeah. So finally, I've got one last mystery, or not just an interesting observation as we close. This is a church bulletin from January 1969. There's the church, beautiful drawing. We have several of those. But notice the address, 510 Church Street. When did our address change? I don't know. Yeah. Did you ever write a letter to the church and use 510 instead of 1604? It's interesting, yeah. So that's all I have with an ending little mystery there. I will say I'm proud to be part of this church. I invite any of you that are here to come back and visit us. This is a very welcome and opening church when we're not in pandemic mode. There's a lot of touching and greeting and joyous celebration, a lot of worship. It's a very simple church. We don't have a lot of rules and regulations. We study the Bible and we teach the Bible and we try to learn about the Bible, and that's about it. And then we worship God and we have communion every Sunday. And that could summarize up what it is. So questions? Any questions from abroad? Okay. Any questions from the audience? Okay, well, I'll turn it back over to y'all. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Earl, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone that came out tonight and got to hear the presentation and see this historic, gorgeous church building of 125 years. Earl, thank you as a membership to the Historical Society.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for all your work on this, and I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight.
What about the fruit?
Oh, yes.
No.
So as you exit, Darlene's going to be on one side and Vicki is going to be on the other. And we made the fruitcake from the original recipe, and we had a lot of fun. And we individually wrapped it and tied it, so it's all individual, COVID safe. So I hope you enjoy it. To me, it's different than the fruitcake that my grandmother made. It's really good. It's called white fruitcake. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming out. Earl, you did a fantastic job.
Thank you.